Hello, everyone. It's been a while, but welcome to another live. We have a very special, interesting topic that we're going to discuss today. Before we get started, everyone, feel free to drop in where you're coming from. It looks like a lot of people. We already have 20 people in just a few seconds. Very exciting. Drop in where you're joining us from. Shout out your city, your state, your country. I'm assuming most of you guys are from the United States, but if you're not, that's cool too. Feel free to let us know. I'm here with a special guest. First, I'll just give a few shout outs. So we see Los Angeles is in the chat from Dina, New Hampshire from Karen. Feel free to keep them coming. Alexandria, Virginia. Okay, we got 3 in. So feel free to keep dropping them in. Shout out where you're from. If you guys see people from other places, we got Wisconsin, South Dakota. Feel free to say hi. But as I was saying, I'm here with a very special guest, Professor Curtis Dozier, the author of a book called The White Pedestal: How White Nationalists Used Ancient Greece and Rome to Justify Hate. It is a book that is not out quite yet, but it has a very special launch date. And I'll let Professor Dozier tell us that launch date, and then feel free to say hi to the people, give a quick introduction.
Yeah, the book is going to be published on January 6th, 2026, the 5th anniversary of the attack on the U.S. Capitol. And it's available for pre-order right now, wherever you buy books.
Yeah, so for anyone who doesn't obviously have the media association, but the book's title and the book's subject heavily relates to a lot of the things that we saw drive at least some of the members of the riot, of the insurrection back in January 6th of 2021. And what Professor Dozier does so well in this book is that he breaks down one specific angle, one specific driver of white supremacy, and justification for white supremacy, which is this appeal to ancient Greece and ancient Rome that many white supremacists, from the Proud Boys all the way back to someone like John C. Calhoun, employed in their racism. And before we jump into the book's topic and the topics that we're going to get into today, feel free to give a quick, just maybe biographical summary of where you're from, where you work, what you study, what you research, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, thanks, Kahlil. I'm Curtis Dozier. As Kahlil said, I'm really happy to be on the live today with you. I teach at Vassar College in Poughkeepsie, New York, about 2 hours north of New York City, here in the States. And I teach in the Department of Greek and Roman Studies here. I'm trained as a scholar of Latin literature. I wrote a dissertation at the University of California on Quintilian, the Roman rhetorical writer Quintilian. But over time, I've gotten more and more interested in the ways that ancient Greece and Rome, the symbolism of ancient Greece and Rome, the texts of ancient Greece and Rome, the political theories from ancient Greece and Rome, the different ways those have been used in different periods since antiquity, including in the founding of our country and right up into the present. And I got interested in this topic of white nationalist movements and ancient Greece and Rome sort of in the mid-2010s, when white nationalism, many white Americans were realizing that white nationalism was alive and well in this country, organized activists promoting white supremacist politics. And a lot of classical scholars noticed something surprising to us, surprising to white classical scholars at least, that these movements were very interested in ancient Greece and Rome. So I started researching that. I started delving into the online ecosystem where these people promote their ideas. And I've written a book about what I found when I did that and what it tells us about the way we think about history and the pervasiveness of racism still in this country.
Yeah. So one thing that you mentioned in the earlier chapters, if not the introduction of the book, is that a lot of white scholars who might be progressive or liberal, whatever you want to call it, initially saw the usage of ancient Greece and Rome as a misappropriation by white nationalists. But one thing that's argued a lot in this book, and once again, we'll delve into this later on more, is the idea that no, that there's actually a lot to work with from the ancient texts to support these ideas of modern racial supremacy, xenophobia, hyper masculinity. So feel free to just maybe lay out that thesis at the onset, and then from there we can jump into the outline that we've spent so
Yeah,
much
great.
time curating, so we can make sure we hit all the topics.
I mean, you put it very generously. You said many white scholars. Well, I mean, the truth is, I thought that. When
Yeah.
I got into this, I thought that what do these people really know? What could they possibly know about the ancient world? And I thought my job as a scholar is to find the places where they've basically lied about history, where they've distorted history, misappropriated history, abused history, whatever words you want to use. I thought my job as a scholar is to find those places, point out the errors, and we're going to fight racism by doing that. And what I found, though, when I really delved into it was sure, there's plenty of examples of that. We'll talk about some. There's plenty of like laughably distorted views of antiquity in white nationalist movements. But I found a whole group of people who know a ton about ancient Greece and Rome, and they understand that they don't need to make up anything about the ancient world because there's so much material in ancient thinkers that lends itself to use to promote white nationalist politics, especially to audiences who assume that ancient Greece and Rome, they don't, to audiences that don't think about white supremacy when they think about ancient Greece and Rome. They don't think about racism and all these disgusting beliefs. They think about, when they think about ancient Greece and Rome, they think about sophisticated philosophy and enlightened political ideals and grand architecture and beautiful art and sculpture and all these high-minded, sophisticated things. And so I think there's, when most people, including me as a scholar, think that about ancient Greece and Rome, when you see violent racists using ancient Greece and Rome, you think, well, this can't have anything to do with the ancient Greece and Rome. I know. But in fact, it has a lot to do with ancient Greece and Rome, as I try to show in the book and argue. And I hope we can talk about that here.
Of course. So now that we can jump into just maybe like the structure that we set out,
Yeah.
I have to ask you the question as a classicist, as someone who just wrote a book about the topic, how often do you think about the Roman Empire?
Kahlil, you're actually the first person ever to ask me that
Oh,
question.
wow.
I know. Maybe people don't care what classical scholars have to say about that. But, I'm teaching Latin this term. I
Mhm.
teach Latin 4 days a week at Vassar. I think about the Roman Empire all the time because I'm teaching Latin. But in a way, the question and the meme, it's not about how much does your job make you think about ancient Rome or the Roman Empire. It's about how much do you think about the Roman Empire when you're just doing your thing, when you're on
Yeah,
your
when
own.
you're off duty,
Yeah, when
off
you're off
duty.
duty, right? And the answer is I don't actually think about it that much, but because of the research I do, what I think about a ton is how much other people think about the Roman Empire.
Mm-hmm.
And I have a Google alert for the Roman Empire that,
Wow.
you know, ping, generates like a list of places where people mention the Roman Empire in journalism and blogs and on Twitter and everything. And so I just glanced at it this morning because to just see where are people talking about the Roman Empire, and I found just from the last week or so, I found the predictable sort of political commentary. America's going the way of the Roman Empire
Mhm.
in decline. I found one about Argentina is going the way of the Roman Empire in decline. I found one about South Africa is going the way of the Roman Empire in decline. Okay, that's stuff you expect. But I also found the Kansas City Chiefs are going the way of the Roman Empire.
Mm.
They're not doing that well this year after being in the Super Bowl last year. And I found this is a little different, but I guess there's this animated show on Adult Swim called Smiling Friends, and in the finale to that show, this is like in news for people who follow Smiling Friends. One of the characters revealed they're 2,000 years old, and the way they showed that was, I see a heart for Smiling Friends. I love it. Um, one of the ways they show that this character lived through all this history is he actually caused the fall of the Roman Empire. And so I believe the meme. That people joke about the meme, but the meme is, oh yeah, men think about the Roman Empire all the time. Well, I actually believe that because we're being told to think about the Roman Empire all the time.
Yeah.
It's hard to, if you're reading anything, it's hard not to think about the Roman Empire because everybody's making comparisons to it all the time.
And out of curiosity, so it seems like a lot of the times that it was brought up recently have been in analogies describing the decline of something.
Hmm.
If I
Yeah.
asked you maybe 20 years ago, it would probably been brought up all in the context of like the 300 movie, and any parody of that. Is there a common usage for where you see the ancient Greece, whether it's like maybe intellectual scholarship or immigration? Like, is there a bit of a difference in between
Hmm.
where the Roman Empire is coming up versus like Athens, Sparta, so on and so forth?
I would say that that when ancient Greece is invoked, it's more of a golden age that we
Mm,
look back to, are invited to look back
that's
to
what I
as
figured. Hmm.
a admirable time period. So Rome, you're right, is often invoked as like admirable, but doomed to collapse and
Yeah,
fail and in the process. And so that it's like a kind of warning. Rome is often
yeah.
invoked as a warning, or I would say as part of kind of like fear mongering
Hmm.
for
Hmm.
political gain is the way Rome is often brought up. Whereas Greece is looked at as a sort of golden age that we should aspire to as a positive model or a
Yeah.
desirable model.
I will say the last time either came up in my life beyond researching for this live, there's a TikToker who is doing a costume analysis and critique based on all the trailers of the new Odyssey movie that Christopher
Oh,
Nolan is
uh-huh.
making.
Uh-huh.
So if you want more, if you want to learn more about ancient societies, feel free to keep on the watch for TikTok and keep on the watch for the new Christopher Nolan movie. And I think from there, we'll see a whole bunch of articles that try to relate it to current events.
And
Um,
if I could just say one thing about Christopher
of
Nolan,
course, yeah.
because I'm kind of saying, it's hard to avoid thinking about the Roman Empire or the ancient world. I mean, that's one of the points in my book is that thinking about the ancient world is pervasive in our society, which
Hmm.
makes it a very fruitful ground for white nationalists to use to promote their politics because they kind of know that a lot of people are already thinking about and paying attention to the ancient world. Christopher
Yeah,
Nolan's movie, I don't know anything about the politics of that movie. I'm very curious to see when it comes out. But what other movie is getting so much press a year, 2 years? You could go back. It had hardly been announced, and there's already all this press and people thinking about it. And that's partly because it's how iconic the ancient world is considered.
yeah, absolutely. It's like a gateway drug, or it can be used at least as a
Mhm.
gateway drug to all the ideas that are associated with it.
Yeah.
I just want to give a quick sort of celebratory huzzah to the fact that we just crossed 100 viewers. Um, right
Welcome,
now, there's over 100 people in here, which is a good
welcome.
sized classroom. And when we post, it goes to so many more. So that's really
Yeah,
exciting.
yeah.
Um,
Thanks for joining us today, everybody.
yeah,
It's
thank
great
you
to be here
everyone
with
for
you.
joining. And feel free throughout this conversation to drop questions in the chat. Substack has like a terrible sort of platform interface for like viewing questions, but I'll try to keep note of them in my head as you guys post. So feel free to drop some questions in there. Okay, so let's jump into how ancient Greece and ancient Rome factor into the idea of white people in general being superior.
Mhm.
So there's two definitions of white supremacy that are generally understood, and I think we can divide it in this way. There's the white supremacy of the sort of stereotypical extremist KKK members, neo Nazis, Proud Boys, so on and so forth. And then there's just like the sort of general. I think Merriam-Webster has a good definition, which is like the general understanding of a superiority of the white race, of white institution, white cultures, European cultures. So I want to start by having you define a term, and that term is going to be Western civilization. How
Mhm.
would you define Western civilization, especially in the context of what we're discussing today?
So I'm a professor, so I'm going to define it a couple different ways.
Of course.
But I think what Western civilization is a shorthand. This is why I want to define it in several different ways because
Yeah.
that term contains a ton. It's a shorthand for a lot of things. It has a kind of political meaning. It has a historical meaning, and then right there in the way it's stated, Western, it has a geographical meaning, or it
Mhm.
attempts to have a geographical meaning. So, in terms of the political meaning, I would say Western civilization is a shorthand for a set of political ideals that most people would say are good things. These are things like human freedom and liberty,
Mhm.
the rule of law, um,
Enlightenment. Yeah.
enlightenment, respect for difference, human rights. I think there's an element of kind of scientific rationality in it. Um,
Empiricism.
so it's empiricism is a good way to put it. And so when we talk about Western civilization, or when that phrase is used, it's a kind of celebration of those political ideals, um, and a declaration that they are kind of a gift to the world from this thing, Western civilization. That Western civilization kind of civilized the world and made the world a enlightened place politically to the extent that that has happened.
Hmm.
Okay, so that's the political part. Those ideals are I think what's meant when people invoke Western civilization. It's historical, and this is where ancient Greece and Rome come in, is because very often, either explicitly or implicitly, when Western civilization is mentioned, there's a reference to ancient Greece and Rome as, say, the foundation or the origin of Western
Hmm.
civilization, and a claim that those political ideals were sort of either first invented or first practiced or first articulated by ancient Greek and Roman political thinkers and
Hmm.
philosophers. And so there's a historical claim that we can draw a line from ancient Greece and Rome, especially ancient Greece. Rome is sort of seen as a like kind of refiner and preserver and continuator.
Yeah.
This is why your question earlier about Greece being a golden age was a really good one, because most of these ideas are thought to have taken their origin in ancient Greece. And so there's a historical claim that says this process of civilizing the world, this this history of bringing enlightenment to the world started in ancient Greece and Rome and continues up to the present day. And this is where we get to the geographical part. Because if you look, and this is kind of where you start to see that there's more going on than just these political ideals. Because if you look at the places that are described as Western civilization, it means Europe, and especially Western Europe. So I guess that's kind of part of where Western comes in, but it also means the United States. So we're moving west from Europe, I guess, and it means Canada.
In Australia.
But then you get Australia, and then you get New Zealand, which are so far west that they're further west than places we call the East,
Yes.
if that makes sense. And so you start to sense the kind of geographical incoherence of this. And you also recognize that all of these places that are described as Western civilization are either inhabited primarily by white people or are places that were colonized by white people.
Hmm.
And so that geographical element is where the sort of ideals of civilization, enlightenment, and everything, I think, starts to kind of crack and show what's really going on with the invocation of Western civilization, because it shows, it reveals that when we talk about Western civilization, we are, when we do it uncritically, we're basically justifying the current global order in which the places described as Western civilization enjoy most of the wealth, most of the political influence. They have military power over most of the rest of the world, especially the global South. And so uh, it it's a it justifies that worldwide inequality, that worldwide white supremacist order, by claiming political ideals, by using political ideals to sort of, I would say, distract from or suppress or erase those inequalities that it justifies.
Yeah. It feels
And
like
it,
a euphemism in a way,
yeah,
almost. Like
that's a good word for it, Khalil.
for white
Definitely.
supremacy.
And when you use it to justify the world order, it's ignoring how that world order came to be.
Hmm.
And this is where the ancient Greece and Rome come in, because we associate ancient Greece and Rome with high-minded political ideals and enlightenment and sophisticated philosophy. And so if you keep the focus on ancient Greece and Rome as the origin, you're kind of saying, all right, well, sure, there's a lot of inequality in the world, but the truth is, white people have a better culture for creating human flourishing that started in ancient Greece and Rome, and that's why there's all this inequality, because the places that have adopted this culture are flourishing and the ones that haven't have not. That's the claim, I think. And that ignores that there's a lot of other reasons why the current global order is the way it is. There's a huge element of luck. This has been demonstrated again and again and again, that places that are in power now just by geographical luck had better access to natural resources, insulation from certain cataclysmic environmental events, insulation from certain plagues and things. Anyway, so there's just a bunch of luck, right? It's not that your culture values freedom more than another one. It was more just like your part of the world was lucky. And then it also ignores the willingness of these places to use violence to obtain power, right? In the form of, all the historical genocides, the enslavement of Africans, the extraction of resources from the global south and places not conventionally described as Western civilization. The euphemism it encompasses all of that. Also, it what do we want to say? Suppresses or distracts away from all of that. And this isn't just like a old-fashioned term, Western civilization. I think it has its origins in kind of Cold War attempts to define a sort of Western European and American identity in like contrast to the Soviet bloc, in this kind of like desire to create a unified identity. I think that's part of the origin of this term Western civilization, but it still exists. You still hear it used. And in fact, you hear current politicians in the Trump administration use Western civilization. You hear Trump himself use Western civilization as a category. There's a relatively new law in Florida that all general education humanities courses must include texts from the Western canon, for example. So I'm not just talking about, mid 20th century people thinking about Western civilization as part of the Cold War. This is a hot political
topic.
And I think we need to see the kind of implicit racial logics included in it, and the way that ancient Greece and Rome, because of their prestige and prominence in history, are part of the way that is made into a euphemism, is part of the way that it erases the violence of the history it celebrates.
Yeah, we have a comment from Alex I think is a good segue based on what you were ending with as well. It says, also ironic that the ethnic group that habited the majority of those empires' political centers. So for ancient Rome, we could think about the people that would have lived in what is now Rome. For Greece, the people that would have lived in like Athens or Sparta or wherever. The majority of those empires' political centers wouldn't have been considered white in certain white supremacist contexts in the 19th century and beyond. So yeah, let's get into that. Let's get into like race, right? So Western civilization, I think there's a lot of commentary about race wrapped into that, however obscured it is with like the words they chose to use with Western civilization. But like when we talk about white supremacy, I think we can get into it specifically, especially just the idea of whiteness. And a lot of times what you find the white supremacists doing is that they'll look to ancient Greece and Rome as not only the cultural and political origins of these ideas that resulted in the supremacy of European peoples and European descended peoples around the world, but they'll also look at it in terms of like a sort of racial origin, that all white people in a way are the spiritual successors of ancient Greece and Rome. So how about we start with maybe defining the term, or at least like getting into like this racial logic, like how and why do white people, at least white supremacists today, see themselves as connected to ancient Greece and Rome as opposed to connected to like whatever farmers dying of like dysentery existed in Northern Ireland at the same time that Rome was at its peak?
Yeah. The way let's keep it with this euphemism idea. The way I think that the euphemism brings in racial logics is through words like ancestry,
Mm,
inheritance, heritage, ancestors. Though, the inheritance of Western civilization, we are the inheritors of Western civilization, our ancestors did this or that. Those are claiming a biological genetic link.
mhm.
And I'm not an expert in, historical genetics,
Yeah, yeah.
but I think we can kind of say that that claim is not even sustainable on a genetic level
Mhm,
over once you go beyond a couple generations. There's just so much mixing of populations
mhm.
throughout history. So, but when we talk about ancestry, there's a what our ancestors did, which you often see in connection with Western civilization. Um, Jeremy Tate, for example, who's one of the promoters of classical Christian education, he promotes that education which includes a lot of classical texts. Um, he promotes that as saying we're going to study things our ancestors cared about, for example. So
Mm.
there's an example of like this appeal to ancestry, or actually this just happened relatively recently. Stephen Miller, Donald Trump's White House advisor and really the
Oh, man.
architect of what we're seeing with xenophobia and harassment of even legal immigrants in this country. At Charlie Kirk's funeral, he gave a speech in which he said, "Our lineage and our legacy hails back to Athens, to Rome." And he lists a few other places. He says, "Our ancestors built the city." So this language of ancestry is there. It's claiming a false genetic connection. And this is where we come around to the idea of race, because the whole idea of race is a false genetic
Mhm.
idea. Um, I don't, you've covered this a lot on your, in your
Yeah, yeah, I can
material.
talk a little bit
I
more
don't,
about,
I
like, the
don't know if I
genetics.
need to give a lecture on that, but
Yeah, 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 but,
it's
like, everyone
basically
I think most people know that race is a social construct. It basically presumes I like the way you put it in some of our notes, but, like, it basically presumes that, similarities in skin color and perhaps like the geographical continent from which you hail from. So like in my case would be Africa, perhaps in your case, I'm assuming would be Europe. That there's a sameness with other people from that continent who have the same skin color or whatever, that goes beyond those two traits. So like the skin color is also a lens into like your intellect and your value system and behavioral traits. And then goes from there into like in large cases, like where you fit in terms of like the global narrative of the world, right? So there was a lot of white supremacists saying that like African people, the African race was always destined for all of time to be enslaved, and that white men were always destined for all of time to be the leaders, and Asian people were always destined to be shrewd and scheming and smart, but in a way that's still like effeminate compared to white men who were dominant.
smart but uncreative is
Smart
the
but uncreative.
is the racist claim about the East. Yeah.
Exactly. So like those are the things that you get with race. And it was largely at least the races that we understand, it pretty much once again categorized by continent. So like white Europeans, black Africans, like quote unquote yellow Asians, red American Indians, and then a lot of course mixes and matches within there, came about during the era of European colonization, and largely in an American sense fomented as a means of instilling a clear population that would be enslaved, a clear population that needed to be genocided. We're talking about Native Americans. And then after waves of immigrants, clear stereotypes about populations and how they would be legally dealt with. So it's a construct, it's made up, and it's fairly recent.
And when we talk about ancient Greece and Rome as our ancestors, most people who do that are not just saying like, "Oh, we share the gene that creates white skin."
Hmm.
That might be true with a decent number of ancient people and me, for example. But of course, there were black people in antiquity.
Yeah.
Like, let's just. I'm sorry we have to say that in this day and age, but like some people will deny that still. But in any case, when people say these are our ancestors, when Stephen Miller talks about Athens and Rome as our ancestor, when Jeremy Tate talks about the texts they teach in classical Christian education as our ancestors, they don't just mean those people looked like us. They mean that they shared a racial identity with us, that they shared the intelligence that white people supposedly have. They mean that they shared the creativity, the dynamism. You see that word a lot in white supremacist tracts that white people supposedly had. And that's why it's worthwhile to read them, so that you as a white person can, recognize and learn to, I don't know, in that, no one puts this explicitly, but to act on your racial dynamism. And I guess the idea is because, of course, in there's a discourse of like, oh well, black people should be reading these texts too, right? I guess the idea is like, oh yeah, maybe you'll learn a little dynamism that
Yeah.
you lack, right? I mean, it's disgusting once you sort of like realize everything that's being implied by these claims of ancestry. That, in a sense, I mean, I think in our discussion we talked about this word racialization,
Hmm.
which is the sort of applying of a racial identity to a group. And in a sense, all declarations of race are racialization, right? Because it means it's not just saying you look a certain way, it's saying this group of people has these characteristics. So just the idea of black people in this country is so steeped in like all these white supremacist ideas about what black people are that you can call that an act of racialization, I'd say.
Yeah, because I think even when slavery was first occurring, right? Like you're dealing with Europeans coming, or at least once again, chattel slavery, transatlantic slave trade, Europeans coming to Africa, and there being these diverse populations. They worship different gods and goddesses and deities, whatever you want to call them. They have completely different like origin stories about their ethnic groups, different ways of living and interacting with the land. They're from completely different regions. If you look at like Mali to the north, which
Mhm.
is like right by the Sahara, and it's nomadic, and there's like desert houses, and it's not too far from like there's cities that exist like Timbuktu, which is like Islamic scholarship centers. And then you compare that to the Congo, for example, where they have kingdoms, but a lot of those times those kingdoms are either coastal or they also go into the more like jungles of the heart of Africa, and there's like completely different animals there. There's completely different ways of interacting with the environment. Once again, different religions. There's all these different groups, but then when they're trafficked, like it's human trafficking, the largest human trafficking. I guess if you count the trans-Saharan slave trade, it might be a little bit similar, but like at least in terms of over an ocean,
It's
the
very
largest.
big, let's say.
Yeah, huge, huge, millions and millions and millions of people being trafficked from all parts of Africa to different countries within the Americas, and then being told that they're all the same, that they're
Yeah.
all the same race. So that's like the sort of quote unquote racialization of Black people. And then one way that I can like expand on that point, as a sort of contrasting example that I think it's relevant to bring up, is the idea of also racializing people in the ancient world. We've obviously talked about racializing ancient Greece and Rome as white, regardless of the actual skin color of the people, or regardless of even if they have the same skin color as white people today, regardless of how similar they are in any other way. And you often find this a lot of times. There's a huge discussion in the Black community about racializing ancient Egypt.
Mhm.
And this has been something that's been going on for centuries. It first started, to be clear, with a lot of the white supremacist Egyptologists either claiming that ancient Egypt was full of white people and that Black people were only slaves, or being in disbelief that, oh, like this is a population that's in Africa, which means they had to be Black, which means that like there had to be a Black empire that was prominent. So it kind of blew their minds. And then from there until this day, there's all these arguments about like what race were the ancient Egyptians, what race were quote unquote people from ancient times. And this also is a continuation of the idea of racialization, because regardless of what these groups look like, let's say they shared a phenotype with me, let's say more likely perhaps they shared a phenotype with the people, or very much more likely the people of the Horn of Africa or North Africa today. Even if that were true, what sameness does that imply between the people of today who look like ancient Egyptians and the actual ancient Egyptians? And what are we valuing in terms of ancient history? Because I think there's there's commentary to be made about valuing specifically ancient Greece and ancient Rome. But there's also commentary to be made about valuing empires. Like, why is it always
Mhm.
an empire that subjugated other peoples, that built great, quote unquote, great monuments? Um, that's exalted when we look at history. Like, why aren't we looking at other civilizations and other types of peoples and other societies and seeing all the values that they might have contributed to either their social order or agricultural order or whatever you want to call it? That maybe a lack of written text or a lack of intersections between those groups and the sort of the empires that then went on to take over the world. That's why we get this like sort of over exaltation of empires, whether they be black, quote unquote, seen as black or white.
The I have some. I have. I mean, I told you this in our pre-show discussion. I have some
Yeah,
sympathy for Black people who want to look to the ancient Egypt or anywhere in the ancient
yeah,
world and
absolutely.
take pride in that, because in a white supremacist culture, you're always being told you have no civilization, you're worthless, like your ancestors never did anything worthwhile, and so it makes sense to me that people would revolt against that and say that's a lie. And but there is a kind of, parallel similarity in this act of racialization as you're describing between sort of assuming that because ancient Egypt did great things, described as great, maybe put it in quotes on your point about like why do we praise the Egypts or excuse me, why do we praise the empires? That says anything about you as someone who shares a phenotype with them. That's a sort of similar racial logic. And it kind of, I have sympathy for it. And it kind of shows how insidious racism is, how insidious white supremacy is, because it makes everyone believe that these racial connections are real, that
Yeah,
these racial fantasies are real. And that's what we need to explode is that idea. um,
absolutely. I think what you're saying is exactly what started it, right? Like it's
mhm.
this idea that white people can see themselves in ancient Greece and ancient Rome and the British Empire and
Yeah,
whatever you want to cite. And that they had these great civilizations to look back on, and that black people were like monkeys or beasts or
yeah.
animals, which is like something that was actually told. I recently wrote an article about how like initially they did not even Christianize black people because they
Mhm.
said black people just don't even have souls. Like it's literally a waste
Yeah,
of
yeah,
time.
yeah, yeah.
So when that is the sort of circumstance that you find yourself in, of course, it makes sense and it's very functional. And it was actually one of the arguments that abolitionists used to even get so it's practical on top of all of these things, to get slavery to sort of like abolish in certain places is this idea that because ancient Egypt exists, that black people are capable of more. And in that way, I think once again, I think we can see the similarity of the logics, but I would argue, and I've said this many times on social media, that like any sort of understanding of why black people look towards the ancient world should be looked at with a lot more context and care
Yeah,
than when looking at like the origins of why white people do it, because it just has completely different origins. One's a reaction
yeah.
to the other.
And
So I appreciate you, yeah, making sure we get on that point.
the when black people do it, it's under so much scrutiny, right? It's
Oh
is
yeah,
like mocked, it's held up, is derided, it's shown as illiterate and uneducated, and yet this whole idea of like the inheritance of Western civilization and our white ancestors in Western civilization is sort of not interrogated that much at all,
no,
right?
not
Like
at
there's
all.
a real hypocrisy in um, criticizing when black people do it, and then just t- taking it as sort of unremarkable or a normal thing to do. All these narratives of Western civilization when white people do it. I want one thing I'll just mention about Egypt is Cleopatra, of course, is like
Mhm.
the really flashpoint figure for racializing the ancient world. Every time someone casts a black actor to play Cleopatra, there's this huge outrage of um, you know people
Animosity,
of animosity again,
yeah,
death threats to the person. This
yeah.
last time for Netflix show, the Egyptian Ministry of Culture like intervened to criticize the show for casting the black actress to play it. I can't think of her name right now. I'm
I
sorry.
can't think of it. I have no
I
idea. But
apologize
I
to
can look it
her.
up as you
Right?
talk.
Yeah, look
I'll
it
look
up
it up
so
as you talk.
we could say her name, right? Um, anyway, nothing makes it more clear, I think, than that animosity. Than the nothing makes it more that animosity makes it very clear that large numbers of people assume the ancient world was racially white because they complain about the way Cleopatra looks when a black actress is cast to play her. They don't complain about anything else about her. They don't complain that she's too tall or too short or too
Mm,
old or too young. It's only about the way she looks. And that reveals that they assume that the way you look means something about who you are as a human being.
yeah, her name is Adele James.
Adele James. Yes, thank you.
Um,
Thank you.
yeah, and yeah, I think that's really important. Like there's a sort of essence, right? I think with any casting decision, there some way, especially when it's a historical figure, there are some ways in which the actor will resemble the character, and there's some ways which they won't. So, like, let's say if it's a Michael Jackson documentary, you're gonna want the actor to ideally have some sort of physical resemblance in a way, but like Michael Jackson conspicuously has changed his physical appearance
I would
throughout
say the
his
actor needs
life.
to be able to dance.
Yeah, so
Is what they need. They
that's what
better
I was
be a
getting
good
at.
dancer, or it is not going to work.
Exactly. So like, that's what I was getting at. Like for a Michael Jackson documentary, above all, maybe not all else, but most things, they need to be a great dancer, right?
Yeah,
For a documentary about, I don't know, like so on and so forth. You guys
yeah,
get the
yeah.
analogy from
Michael
there.
Jordan.
Michael
Any
Jordan,
of
they could
these.
tall, right? But like when it comes to these ancient figures, especially someone like Cleopatra, anyone who populated ancient Rome, ancient Greece, ancient Egypt, it seems like their race, above all else, like they could be as adept of a speaker, they could be as beautiful or not beautiful as someone is told, as someone is written about in ancient texts. But above all else, it seems like their race has to be the one thing that you get right. Let alone this, like Adele James is not like the most dark skinned,
Mm-hmm.
sort of like phenotypically West African person that have ever existed either. So it's like it just goes to show that like yeah, like there's a certain racial component of blackness that really just pisses people off in these situations.
And the reason it matters for the ancient world, the reason people get pissed off in the ancient world is because it threatens this idea of racial continuity from the ancient
Mm,
world to
mm.
that underlies the Western civilization narrative and justifies the current global order. Because if that gets threatened, then all of a sudden you got to address the like grotesque inequalities of the global order and the history of violence that produced them. Like it's much more comfortable to keep the euphemism, to keep the shorthand of like, civilizational cultural supremacy with a sort of hidden racial element that makes everything in the current world make sense instead of makes everything in the world look like a, you know, system of violent domination.
Yeah, and we got a comment that I think is also a good segue right on time. They say, to be fair, regular Nazis and Italian fascists were obsessed with Rome. So now we're gonna get into like the extremist component of it,
Mm.
which
Yeah.
obviously Nazis and Mussolini and his company were. Um, but yeah, so let's talk about like what. Or I guess I'll have you start with just like describing how Sparta was involved in January 6th insurrection.
Yeah, which actually, I mean, I love the comment because there's a quote from a visit of Goebbels to Sparta where he says, "When I'm in Sparta, I think I am in a German city." So Sparta was a very important touchstone for the Nazis. And since the comment was made, let me just say one general point of my book is that the Nazis and the Nazis and the fascists and current white nationalists are obsessed with ancient Greece and Rome because there's so much that lends itself to their politics. And in connection with that, they're so popular and admired in the general population so that the white nationalists or the fascists or the neo-Nazis sort of know that if they can find a model for fascist politics in ancient Greece and Rome, most people will at least consider taking it seriously because they think of the ancient world as a source of wisdom and ideas worth taking seriously.
Yeah, like the
And
gateway drug
Sparta's a big
analogy.
one of that. So, we started talking about how my book's coming out on the anniversary of the Capitol riot, and that really was a high profile event where what I call in the book white nationalist classicism. Invocations of the classical world by white nationalism were on full display because, you know, there was a noose hung on the Capitol lawn. People were flying Confederate flags in the Capitol. All these white supremacist symbols, and alongside it, there were a couple people who put on Spartan-style military helmets as part of their rioting, and they also flew flags with this ancient Greek slogan "Molon Labe," translated "Come and take them," which has sort of been embraced by anti-government and pro-gun groups in this country. So there were unambiguous white supremacist symbols, and then there were also these classical symbols and many other kinds of symbols there too. So, you look at these guys putting on a Spartan helmet, going to overthrow the government, and it's like, okay, they saw the film 300, and they're trying to be cool. Like, it doesn't seem like they know much about history. And those individuals, I don't know them, but they probably don't know that much about history. But what they're doing is they're using the ancient world to make a violent insurrection against, to try to subvert democratic processes, right? They were trying to stop the certification of President Biden. They're trying to make that seem honorable and glorious and heroic. So they turned to Sparta as a admired model of masculine valor in defense of a civilization, because the ancient Spartans, famously, this is the story of the film 300. They tried to stop the Persians from invading Greece. They failed. They were all killed after they were betrayed at the Battle of Thermopylae. But, they made a heroic last stand to try to save their civilization, is the idea of the Spartans. And so these people at the Capitol riot wanted to see themselves that way. And so they put on those helmets and they imagined President Biden and the people who voted for him as a threat to the survival of their civilization. And they said, we're going to make a heroic last stand to try to save that. So that's Sparta being used. Where does this come from? It's not just from 300, though. I mean, maybe it is just from 300, but what I show in my book is that this is actually not that big a distortion of history, because if you read the ancient sources about Sparta, they indulge in the same fantasy about Sparta that the Capitol rioters are engaging in. If you look at Plutarch, who wrote a biography of the Spartan lawgiver Lycurgus, probably a mythological figure. But anyway, he wrote a biography of Lycurgus. He talks a lot about how Lycurgus founded Sparta. If you look at Xenophon, who was actually an eyewitness, had been to classical Sparta, he wrote a lot about how Sparta was established and the laws of Sparta. Both of them, really glorify ancient Sparta for all the same reasons that I think the Capitol rioters and the film 300 glorifies them. And so it isn't really a distortion of history. Now, you could say that Plutarch and Xenophon are kind of biased writers. Plutarch is writing, here we come back to empires, and the way that empire kind of violence creates more violence, I guess I would say. Plutarch's writing under the Roman Empire. He's a Greek writing under the Roman Empire at a time when his culture is being subsumed into this imperial machine. And so a lot of Plutarch's work can be understood as trying to kind of preserve ancient Greek culture against imperial domination. And one way he does that is by talking about how amazing Sparta was, like indulging in this fantasy about Sparta. And Xenophon, similarly, Xenophon is much earlier than Plutarch, but he's writing at a time when he thinks Sparta's in decline. And so he's like, I'm going to show how bad Sparta's become in my time by talking about how great it used to be and how they used to create the best warriors. And, everything was done so that these men would be unstoppable fighting machines, and everything was about honor and serving your community and all these ideals. Maybe those are kind of politically biased in their time, but those have been very influential. That if you just read the text, that's what they're promoting. And I think the Capitol rioters picked up on that.
Yeah. So it seems like on one hand we have the writers who, to various degrees, actually understand these ancient texts, and like maybe on one end, just like there's a aesthetic appeal of like men fighting dark brown sort of foreigners that they got from the movie. And on the other
Yeah.
end, there's like actual texts and biographies and histories that support some of the same values that they might hold. Um, and I think a lot of times people think about like white supremacists, they think of like hillbilly sort of once again like the January 6th rioters have like they become like a stereotyped
Yeah.
image, regardless of how accurate it is. But another thing that you talk about, I want to make sure I think I'm saying it right, but the intellectual right.
Yeah.
So these are people who deeply study and understand and can quote and have knowledge of ancient Greece, ancient Rome, texts about them from people later on in the world. And they also produce very white supremacist ideas and talking points, one of them being the Great Replacement,
Hmm.
which, if I'm not mistaken, was created by a gay rights advocate from Paris.
Yeah. Or France,
Highly
at least in
intellectual
France. Yeah.
from France, from
Renaud
France.
Camus. Yeah.
Highly trained, like highly educated gay rights advocate from
Yeah.
France.
He's won literary prizes. Yeah. He's known as like as a, you know, significant figure in the French gay literary scene.
Yeah. So how do we get from that to these white supremacist ideas? Like, I guess I want you to talk about
Yeah.
like maybe like the true existence of these ideas within ancient
Yeah.
Greece and Rome.
I mean, this is a big part of my book is about my journey of as a scholar and a white person of thinking I was only going to find hillbilly yahoos using the ancient world and finding there's actually a whole subset of people who know a ton about ancient
Mhm.
Greece and Rome. Um, a lot of them have PhDs. A lot of them are fluent in foreign languages, and they write, academic treatises that publish in major publications online and even in print in some cases that I think kind of lay the intellectual groundwork for the things we see at the Capitol riot. The Great Replacement conspiracy theory is a good example of that. Um, Renaud Camus didn't come up with the idea that white people are in danger of being exterminated as a result of immigration. Some versions think that there's a Jewish plot to exterminate white people. It's a kind of classic anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. It, Teddy Roosevelt, to some extent, subscribed to it, but the current version is called The Great Replacement, and it has its origins in this French book by Renaud Camus, um, in which he writes about he writes about immigration to France and how he thinks that like Frenchness and is going to be destroyed because of Islamic immigration. And he's a very good writer. He's a prominent literary figure in 20th century French literary history. And he begins his book in French with a discussion of a dialogue of Plato. That's the classics,
Mm.
connection. And basically, he's saying a couple things with that, like, look at me, I know Plato. I'm smart enough to understand Plato. You should take seriously what I'm saying about immigration. Um, and and he's I don't know if we have time to get into it here. You can read about it in my book, but he
We have a little bit of
basically
time. We have a little bit
he
of time. Like if you want to
he's
get into
basically
it.
saying, he doesn't quite say Plato agrees with me, but he's kind of like some of these concepts that Plato developed show that I'm right
Yeah.
about immigration. Okay, so he wrote this book. One thing I find kind of funny is that the French version begins with the discussion of Platonic dialogue. The English version, he moves that to like page 140 or something. Like he thought it would get more traction in France. The point is, he's using the ancient world as a source of prestige for his ideas. Fast forward, um, you know, when did that book come out? I don't know, probably about 10 years ago now. I don't know the exact date. Fast forward though to the late 2010s and the early 2020s, and Tucker Carlson, the most watched figure in cable news, is talking about the Great Replacement conspiracy theory. He doesn't call it a conspiracy theory, but he talks about the Great Replacement using the language that Renaud Camus developed, Le Grand Remplacement. He's using that. It gets to the point where a survey showed that something like 70% of Republicans subscribed on some level to this, agreed with the idea of the
Hmm.
Great Replacement or thought it was really happening. So this weird intellectual in France coins this phrase that a few years later you know, large numbers of Americans accept and agree with. In fact, there was a study done of the Capitol 6 rioters that showed that belief in the Great Replacement was the number one predictor of
Mm,
participation in the riot. So it becomes a very influential idea. Now, none of the people on January 6th, Tucker Carlson doesn't know that Renaud Camus used Plato to promote it, right? The classical part isn't there, and in fact, we'll probably never know, like, the process by which it gets from Renaud Camus to the rioters on January 6th. But I have to believe that, the the intellectual sophistication, politically bad, but intellectually sophisticated, is racist, politically bad, but it's intellectually sophisticated. The intellectual sophistication of Camus' original formulation led to someone to be like, oh, I'm going to take this seriously. I'm going to promote it a little more. And then other people take it seriously, and it gets promoted, and it finds its way online, and it finds its way through the message boards. And before you know it, Tucker Carlson is promoting it to millions and millions of people on TV, maybe never thinking about Plato, because that's sort of been lost along the way. But I guess the larger point is there are very smart people who are figuring out how to promote white nationalist politics. They're using ancient Greece and Rome to do it. My book is full of examples. We're almost out of time, so we're not going to be able to go through too many more examples. My book is full of examples of them using ancient Greece and Rome in authentic, undistorted ways that you can read about. And I think if you look at what's happening in this country now, it works.
yeah.
Donald Trump just tore down a wing of the White House to replace it with a classical temple. If you look at the plans for his new wing of the White House, the goal of these activists is to make racist ideas respectable by connecting them to ancient Greece and Rome. They have many ways of doing that, but this is one of the ways they do it. And you look at what's going on in this country right now, it works.
So let's just talk about some of the solutions to maybe end on a more positive note. And these solutions are more, I mean, like they're more like ideological than
Mm-hmm.
actionable. But I mean, I think ideas are what drive action.
Yeah.
So,
We got to have
um,
both.
yeah, let's just go. I'm gonna just read them out. I'm gonna read out the claim, and I just want you to maybe expand on it, right?
Okay.
So let's start with history isn't just Western European empires.
Right. So the ancient Greeks and Romans have been given so much prominence in our educational system. I'm a professor of classics. I think one reason I became a professor of classics is because they've been given so much prominence in my
Yeah.
training. It was like, what else was I going to study? um, I don't. I'm not here canceling classics. I'm not here canceling Greece and Rome. I think they're worth studying. There are things we can learn. There are things we can realize about why the modern world is the way it is. And once you realize that the modern world didn't have to be this way, that it was made this way because of ways people invoked ancient Greece and Rome, that helps us dismantle it. So I think there's value in studying ancient Greece and Rome and Western European empires. But your point is right on target in that so much is excluded from that. And part of realizing that the modern world doesn't have to be the way it is, right? If we believe that a better world than the one we have is possible, let's get hopeful, right? If we believe that a better world than the one we have is possible, we need to know that this was not inevitable. This was not predestined for it to be this way. And I think studying different parts of history are one of the ways to show that. You already referred to it. You'll realize that different ways of living have a different orientation to the land, have a different orientation to conflict resolution with each other. They have a different orientation to the distribution of resources.
Mm,
Um, and one reason that ancient Greece and Rome and Western empires in general are so prominent in our education system is because it sort of prevents you from thinking about other ways of running the world. It keeps you in the imperial way of running the world.
yeah. Yeah.
If that's all you know has ever happened in history.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. It's like a psyop almost. Like it's a psyop to turn us all into imperialists. I think there's a
I know. I
quote
don't
that
want to be
says,
there being like, that's what they want you to think. But
yeah.
but
I'm
there's an
like,
element to that.
I'm sure there's not necessarily. I think I'm sure at one time there was like probably a group of people like planning. Okay, like we need to instill ancient Greece and Rome so children believe in the supremacy. But I think now it's like something that just comes with the territory of like
Yeah,
the
yeah.
path dependence. It's so ingrained that almost like naturally we look towards empire. We look towards
Yeah.
empire as symbols of
And
greatness.
it's not just ingrained, it's comfortable, right? Because the
Mhm.
world is very imperial, and if history looks very imperial, then you're kind of like, well, this is how it had to be. And that's not true.
Yeah, absolutely. So we kind of got into the second one, which is history isn't just about empires, but let's talk about like how do you see classics being expanded upon or changed or
Mm.
reformed in order to highlight the strengths and weaknesses of various civilizations? Do you think it should be reformed? Does classics, by definition, have to follow what we know as the Western civilization, or could
Yeah.
it include oral histories from Tanzania? You know, something like random like that. Like what can classics be to make it better?
I mean, there's a lot of debate and discussion within the discipline about that. That I think probably gets a little into the weeds for what we're talking about
Hmm.
for our audience in this format. But I think the biggest thing that I would invite your viewers to learn about and like add to their knowledge of the ancient world is the ways that different groups of people and different identities have engaged with the ancient Greek and Roman world.
Mm,
So I've been talking about the ways that politically powerful white people have used the ancient world, have been interested in the ancient world. But kind of just thinking about well, just thinking about, what you brought up about, Black people finding pride in the ancient world. Um, it, it's really transformative to learn about the ways that Africans and African Americans have thought about ancient Greece and Rome,
mm,
because they don't have the same assumptions about it that white people do. They don't see it in the same way, and so you can as early as there was education for Black people following emancipation in the United States, there were demands in the Black community for classical education. They
mm,
wanted to study the ancient world. They saw it as a source of like useful knowledge for themselves and of to like establish a historical connection with their civilizations, as we were talking about earlier. So it's really interesting to learn about how W.E.B. Du Bois, how Charles Chestnut, how Anna Julia Cooper, William Sanders Scarborough, the first first African American classical scholar, how they thought about the ancient world. And there's a lot of books on that. You can read about. Oh, Phyllis Wheatley was an enslaved woman who wrote classical poetry. Um, and what's interesting about people like Wheatley and Du Bois and Chestnut is they're not just celebrating the classical world, they're very critical of it in a way that the white tradition is not as critical. So they understood that they you can already read in the 19th century and even earlier in Phyllis Wheatley, that they understood the ways that white people use antiquity to promote racist politics. And they were able to criticize that. And they were able to use antiquity to criticize it. So it's really fascinating. Learn what African Americans have done with classics. Toni Morrison studied classics at Howard and used classics a lot in her novels. Not as many people would assume, like as a source of inspiration. It's not like classics elevated Toni Morrison. No, she used the ancient world. She used the ancient world in her books as a critique of white
mm,
supremacist politics.
mm.
So learn what African Americans and other Africans did with antiquity, and learn what Asian Americans and Asians did with antiquity. There's a new group in classics, relatively new, the Asian and Asian American Classical Caucus, that's doing a ton to promote research on Asian and Asian American receptions of classics. There's like a new book series coming out and everything. Learn about these histories. There's so much more to antiquity and what antiquity can mean when you study what non-white people have thought about
Yeah,
antiquity.
yeah. I think one interesting book also that kind of relates to this topic is like Orientalism by Edward
Mhm.
Said.
Yeah,
Because it talks about it kind of more traces how there's been a certain sort of in the same way that like Western civilizations group together, Eastern civilization has been grouped together, whether that means like the Far East or the more like near quote unquote Near East and Islamic civilizations, or just one amalgamation of everything
yeah.
that's like East
Very often one giant
Mountain.
amalgamation, right?
Yes.
Similar
And
like to what you described for Africa.
Absolutely. I think that's a really important way to understand because I think a lot of times when you hear ancient Greece and Rome being like the start of civilization for the West, you often hear like that the war between the Spartans and the Persians,
Yeah.
or the Persian invasion as being like sort of like the spiritual precursor to every sort of battle, every war, everything that's happened between a white quote unquote nation and like an Asian or
Yeah.
and I guess some ways Russian nation as well.
And Said begins his book with a discussion of Aeschylus, ancient Greek playwright Aeschylus's Persians. It starts with classical material, and he's arguing, this is where Europeans started viewing the East as a threat, as degenerate, as servile, as an amalgamation.
Yeah.
It starts in ancient Greece, and so yeah, that's a great example. Here he is, a Palestinian, a very politically active person, using ancient Greece and Rome to criticize rather than justify a white supremacist order.
Absolutely. So thank you so much again. I'm gonna leave like maybe a minute as I give this outro for people to drop questions. Drop your questions, drop your questions. I've got to do a big cheer. We passed 200 people. So that's like a really good sized lecture, at least from
Amazing.
my experience at
Thanks to
Yale.
everyone
So
for being here.
yeah, thank you guys for joining. And this is once again just the people who are available at 11 spontaneously to join in. So excited for many other people to see this as well. Yeah, feel free to drop your questions. Until then, make sure you get the book. Once again, it's called The White Pedestal: How White Nationalists Use Ancient Greece and Rome to Justify Hate by Curtis Dozier. Once again, feel free to say where people can get it, when again, and then maybe where they can find you in the meantime.
Yeah, the book's available for pre-order. It's available on Amazon. It's available on Indigo, on BarnesandNoble.com, anywhere you buy books. If you go to Yale University Press, they're publishing it. Yale Books. If you Google Yale University Press, you can go there. You can use the promo code WIN26, WIN26, and get 30% off your pre-order there. So that's a you know special offer for
Yeah, that's a
Khalil's
surprise. I didn't know
viewers.
that was happening. Wow,
Um,
what can you guys
and
get?
yeah, I mean, there's just so much more there. I'd love to have you take a look, see what you learn. I'm on Blue Sky. You can follow me at Curtis Dozier on Blue Sky, and I'd love to hear from you there. This has been a great conversation, though, Kahlil. I really
Yeah.
appreciate the opportunity to talk to your viewers about this and hear from you about it.
Of course.
Hear
Well,
from
yeah,
you about
thank you
it too.
again for joining. This is really exciting. I am excited to maybe make some short form content coming from this. I think there's a lot of quotables and clips. Um, and yeah, just exposing the quote unquote psyop that is our obsession with ancient Greece and Rome,
All
to
right.
whatever degree that's true. But yeah, once again, thank you so much for joining. Bye everyone. And I'll see you in the next live.
Yeah, thanks for being here.